Hello, and welcome to Represent NYC on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Thank you for joining us. I'm New York State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli. As the state's Chief Financial Officer, it's my job to make sure New York is in good financial health. I keep a particularly close eye on New York City because it's the engine that helps run the state's economy. My guests today are two members of the state legislature. We'll be discussing the issues that they are addressing in the session that just started. My first guest is Assembly Member Harvey Epstein. Assembly Member Epstein has been a lawyer, a community activist, a public interest attorney, a community organizer, active on housing and so many other issues, particularly in his East Side neighborhood, a former PTA president, I think, as well. And he took his passion for social justice by seeking elective office, now represents Manhattan's East Side in the State Assembly. Assemblymember Epstein, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, that district is Baruch houses up to the UN on the east side.
Exactly.
Pretty much, that's many, many great and legendary neighborhoods.
Yeah, I'm really privileged to be able to represent that part of the city.
And last year you had to run in 2018, I guess, in 3 different elections, right?
3 different elections, yes. We had the special election, primary, and general. So a little bit of a reprieve this year.
Well, and now it's back to work with the 2019 session starting.
Yeah.
Give us a sense of what your priorities are for your district as the session starts, and obviously there's been a lot of issues that have been tackled already. What has been most important to you as we've started and kicked off this session?
Yeah, so the big issues that I'm dealing with, as well as all New Yorkers, are the MTA is a huge issue we're going to have to grapple with, and funding that. Public education. We're talking about the campaign fiscal equity and the foundation aid and how we're going to deal with the $4 billion the city's owed. And we did early voting, so it was one of my priorities to talk about early voting, bringing sure the primaries came together. And rent regulation and housing issues, the rent laws that expire later this year, and we're going to figure out how we're going to strengthen the rent law to protect New Yorkers all over the state.
You were a member of the Rent Guidelines Board.
Yeah, I sat on the Rent Guidelines Board for 5 years as one of the 2 tenant representatives.
Yeah. So you bring a rather unique perspective and experience. Given the change in the leadership in the state Senate, one assumes that the debate will be a little different than previous years. If you had your wish list in terms of what you would see as the priorities to protect your tenant constituents, what would you most like to see as part of any changes in rent regulation?
Well, first we want to say, the governor, when he released his State of State in his budget, talked about some of the rent law fights we're going to be having, and it was great to see the governor being supportive of ending vacancy deregulation, ending the preferential rent system. So right now, let's say you're paying $1,800, and the legal rent on the lease is $2,900. Your rent can go from $1,800 to $2,900 in 1 year.
1 year.
So what we're going to do is, I think, end that preferential and keep saying it's preferential for the life of that person's tenancy. That's a huge win. 2 big issues that we haven't heard much from the governor, I expect to hear more, is on major capital improvements and what another one called individual apartment improvements, or IAIs. For the IAIs, the individual apartment improvements, it allows a landlord, when a unit is vacant, to spend, let's say, $100,000, whether they spent it or not, and they raise the rent from $1,500 to $3,500, really making that unit unaffordable. That has been a lot of, we've seen a lot of fraud in that system because there's no checks, there's no oversight. The housing agency just accepts whatever the landlord says. So I think we need real change in the IAI system, as well as the major capital improvements. Instead of doing work inside an apartment, you're doing building-wide work, pointing, new roofs, and that passed along to the tenants of 6% on top of their rent guidelines increases has really seen a dramatic increase in rents across the city and affordability. Just in Stuyvesant Town alone, I think we have 26, 27 MCIs pending today. Rents going up by hundreds of dollars. And so if we want to keep affordable housing in New York, we need to really deal with the IAI system and the MCI system.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the issue of affordability. I mean, we hear about it all the time. So many great things about the city. So many people want to be here, but the challenge of continuing to live here is very, very tough. And in terms of the workforce that you need to provide the services, you want to have a diversity of income levels and opportunities there.
Right. And it's, obviously it's a lot in the city, but it's all over the state. As you know, on Long Island, the issues of affordable housing, that's critical upstate, whether it's affordable apartments or mobile mobile homes.
Yeah.
We've seen this crisis across our state where mobile home parks are closing, and people who just need places to live don't have those opportunities.
Yeah.
So we need to have a statewide conversation around how we keep affordability. It's great we went to the $15 minimum wage for the city, you know, and around the state, a little lower the rest of the state, phasing it in. But that's still a full-time person working, you know, 40 hours a week can't afford to live in New York State.
Yeah.
They just can't.
Yeah.
You know, there is caps on how far we can raise the minimum wage in New York. So the other side is just the affordability conversation that we need to continue to have.
Yeah. You mentioned the MTA. Everybody mentions the MTA these days, right? And certainly from my perspective, and you know, we've done many reports and studies, and we do, of course, our audits. There's no doubt they need another revenue stream. You could talk about efficiency and changing management, but it's very clear the enormity of the task before the MTA means it needs an additional revenue stream. Congestion pricing has been kicked around a great deal. Seems to have a little more support perhaps in 2019 than it did before. What are your views on congestion pricing? How viable is that from an Albany perspective? Where do you see that opportunity for more funding for the MTA going?
Yeah, I think there's 4 or 5 different buckets that we need to think about for funding for the MTA. One, you know, I was glad to hear the MTA put off the fee raise today. I think the idea of increasing the cost of the subway is really a regressive tax. It affects the people with the lowest income the worst. So I'm glad to hear the MTA is not going to be voting on that this week. I think that's one conversation. The second one is thinking about for hire vehicles. You know, we were able to pass legislation last year, and that's been put on hold by litigation. The courts. So I think we need to think about, you know, we have 30,000 for hire vehicles driving around the city every day. That contributes to congestion. A fee related to that could really put millions of dollars into the bank for the MTA. Third bucket is increasing the millionaires and billionaires taxes. I know we're going to renew probably the existing taxes on millionaires and billionaires, but there's some
extending the surcharge. Seems the governor included that in the budget.
Yeah, so that's
every time it comes up, we seem to do that.
Right, but I think we need to talk about additional revenue, and in some ways, we need to ensure that the people who can afford it the most can pay those costs. And then there's congestion pricing. You know, within congestion pricing, the bridges and tunnels, I think we fundamentally have to think about putting costs on all the bridges, whether it's 59th Street Bridge, Brooklyn, Manhattan. We can't allow those free rides because it just is, you know, that's not sustainable. The second piece of it is how you drive within the zone below 60th Street. And I think that's where the toughest conversation is going to be in the Assembly. I don't think we're going to have a hard time on the bridges and tunnels. We're going to really have a tough time of driving below 60th Street. In some ways, I understand that logic for people who have low-income constituents outside of my district who are coming in because they have to drive for work. So we're not gradating it related to income. So if we had a larger conversation of saying, well, maybe it's congestion pricing, but $10 to you and me might be something different than $10 to someone who's making minimum wage. And $10 to someone who's a millionaire and billionaire is very different than it is to the rest of us. So if we're just doing this, it's a congestion pricing flat plan, it is a bit regressive. So we need to think of how we can be creative in a way that reduces congestion on our streets and creates funding streams for the MTA. I think, to be honest, I think just a flat fee is going to have a hard time passing this year. So I think unless we're going to be creative, which we could be, because I think there's a lot of opportunity there to do that, then I think that's the best path forward. And maybe separating into other pieces like we did with the for hire vehicles, maybe doing the bridges and tunnels, and then adding pieces on top of pieces.
There's also a lot of talk of late on the governance structure of MTA. You know, you could argue it many different ways, and is sometimes a debate about changing the governance a side issue that doesn't really get to the fundamental issues of resources and management. But when you talk to your constituents, I'm sure they have many opinions on the MTA generally. Does that notion of perhaps the city taking back control of the subways resonate with people, or the idea of not having a consolidated transportation system, breaking it up? Does that make sense, or do people not really key in on that as a solution?
Yeah, I think I've heard mixed feelings about it. I think some people feel like bring it back to the city. I think there's a lot of concerns. If the city takes control of the MTA, the state will then absolve itself of responsibilities for funding public transportation. But to be honest, right now, the governor has control over the MTA board. And whatever he says, he wants to say, he's the one who said in a press statement that we're not closing the L train. It wasn't the board, it was the governor. And so the board will follow what the governor has to say. So in reality, we may claim that the structure is slightly different, and yeah, in reality, it's slightly different. But in practice, the governor controls it. So could we modify the board to make that clearer? We could, but I don't think that's really what we need to do. I think we need to do is focus on the revenue and then focus on how this system and function works. I do think there's a logic to thinking about how we separate the subways from Metro North and Long Island Railroad, because they're different systems, and making sure those streams are clear and concise and transparent, because people take the Long Island Railroad and Metro North need to know the funding is going to them, like people who go on the subways need to know funding is coming to them as well.
We just have a few minutes, but I do want to touch on another big issue that you mentioned, and that's the issue of education, educational funding. Obviously, you're very involved with your children's education, being involved with the PTA. I know you care about that issue, and you mentioned a campaign for fiscal equity, the CFE case, and the notion, which some debate, that the city is owed money from that. How do you see school funding? The governor put, I guess, a little less than $1 billion in as far as an increase. Traditionally, the legislature adds to whatever the executive proposes. How do you see the positioning at the start of the budget process as far as school aid for the coming year? And what would you like to see the outcome be?
Yeah, I do think for across the state, we're really underfunding public education. And I know we are doing more than other states around the country, and I applaud that effort. But in the reality is there are schools, where my son's middle school, 31, 32 kids in a classroom, one teacher, Title I school, that school needed more funds. And, I've been to dozens of schools in my district, and, Title I schools are struggling. And so we need to do a better job funding those schools so kids can have a high quality education. So I do think we need to talk about the $4.3 billion in foundation aid that needs to be funded. I think both on the Senate and the Assembly side, and I think your next speaker can talk a lot about that, about how we need to step our responsibilities up to the public school, and then say, once we start funding it, how do we operationalize it? How do we ensure that schools that have the highest need get that funding? I know that's concerned the governor. He raised that last week about ensuring that the schools with the highest need get the funding. I think we do a really good job here in New York City, and I want to continue to encourage that. So we have a lot of schools that have funding because their parent association might be donating money on Long Island. Schools get funded because of the real estate taxes, the school taxes in the neighborhood. So schools that have higher income property end up getting higher money, so their schools are doing better. I think we need to talk about that system in a way that ensures that neighborhoods and communities that have lower property tax bases can get additional state resources, and places in the city that need it can get additional resources. And I think if we start having that honest conversation, because we have a system that's set up that's discriminatory based on income. So if you're in a wealthy neighborhood, your schools are going to be better funded automatically. So we need to stop that, we need to talk about it, and then we need to talk about how we're going to fix that, and that's what the state's responsibility is.
It's a challenge, because I remember when I served in the legislature, when I ran, of course, saying we're going to get our fair share for our schools. As you know, I come from Long Island, where your family's from. And I arrived in Albany, and I found out that everybody else ran on the same platform. That we're going to get our fair share. Upstate felt downstate was getting it. City felt Long Island was getting it. Long Island felt the city. It is complex because the taxing structure, as you point out, is so different. But there's no doubt that there are too many schools and certainly too many students in need that aren't getting the education that they should be getting. And again, there may be other issues involved, but resources and having the dollars are obviously a key part of it.
And then we need to, at least in the city, have other conversations. We've got to talk about the specialized high school admissions process.
That's going to be a hot issue,
right? Hot issue. Middle school admissions process. I think we're setting up families for failure in some ways, like the middle school admissions process. One of the factors people look at is attendance. There's no fourth grader who can get to school on time that has anything to do with that fourth grader. It has to do with their family and their parents. That child who couldn't go to school that day had nothing to do with that child. That has to do with family structures that are complicated. So we need to ensure that we're not creating admissions process that are already biased within their nature, because this is how families function. Luckily, my kids could get to school on time because my wife and I were able, two-parent household, we could get them there. we have opportunities. Not every family is situated like us, and we need to be thinking about the cross-section of New Yorkers who struggle in a variety of ways.
So many important issues, and we'll have to have you back to talk about some more. We're just about out of time.
Yeah.
But Harvey, you bring such a wealth of experience from the community, and the passion that you had for those issues as an activist, you have certainly brought to your tenure as an Assembly member. We wish you continued success. I look forward to working with you for a long time.
Thank you. I look forward to it, and thank you for your leadership for our state and our finances. We all rely on you. You're doing an amazing job.
Thank you. Thank you. Assembly Member Epstein, thank you again for taking time to be with me. We're going to take a short break and continue discussing New York issues with my next guest. Thank you for watching Represent NYC on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Represent NYC. I'm New York State Controller Tom DiNapoli. State Senator Robert Jackson has a long record of public service, fighting for educational equality as a community school board president, for affordable housing as a member of the New York City Council, and now he's brought his talents and experience and energy to the state Senate. Senator Jackson, thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you, Tom. I appreciate it, and thank you for having me here today.
Well, you represent a very important district on the west side, a very diverse district, and you are part of this new Democratic majority in the state Senate and has really been off to such an ambitious start. So many key pieces of legislation already being adopted. How are you feeling at the start of this session in terms of where you see your priorities and what's been accomplished so far, and what do you hope to accomplish in the next couple of months?
Well, I would say, hooray! Obviously, because now we're in a Democratic majority, and some people say, oh, the Democrats are now in control of the state Senate. And I say, it's not about control. It's about leadership. And so I've expressed that to people in the street, my constituents. I've expressed that to my colleagues. It's not about control. It's about showing leadership. And so with the new majority leader, Andrea Stewart-Cousins, the first woman ever in the history of New York State, and the first woman of color also, you know, we look forward to many things being done. And obviously, the past 2 weeks, is showing that we are not waiting. We're getting things done. And that's so important for people that have been looking for things to be done for years and years and years. Some of my colleagues in the state Senate, especially Gustavo Rivera of the Bronx, he says, you guys don't know, you know, what we've been through for years and years, and we're like so pleased and happy that you're now in the state Senate because we're going to get things done. And that's important.
Well, one big item was the DREAM Act, right? I mean, that was an incredible moment. How many years there's been fighting so that the children of undocumented families could have the same access to financial aid for higher education, and the dream is now a reality, right?
The dream is a reality. In fact, I believe in the email that I received that the governor is going to sign it into law, I believe this week. I have to look at where the location, and hopefully I will be able to be there also. But let me just tell you, on the floor of the Senate, and for the, especially you know, but members of the public, there's 63 of us sitting in the Senate. And Jose Peralta's wife and his children and his family were up front to the left. And they were watching as we deliberated, as we commented on our vote. And even some of the Republicans expressed their fondness and appreciation for Jose Peralta, but they felt for their personal reasons or based on their constituency that they had to vote no. Clearly it passed. But when it passed, everyone stood up and applauded, and you could see the Peralta family hug each other and crying and what have you. I mean, obviously, it's an honor to name it after Jose Peralta, a Democrat that has been fighting for years in this particular matter. So
who unfortunately passed away not that long ago.
Not too long ago, but anyway, it's an honor for him and his family to have it named after him. And as you know, one of the issues was that why should we, as a government, pay for what some people call illegal people to go to college? And some of us spoke on the floor about the fact that these non-citizens they bring over $150 million to the economy of New York State.
Economic activity, absolutely.
Yeah, and that them graduating from high school and want to further their education will help improve the economic situation in New York State. That's a win-win situation for
We
everyone.
did a controller's report on that, and for a modest amount of money, I think about 20 million, maybe a little more, the millions more that would come back with the greater earning power of someone going through college, and such progressive states as Texas already provide for this kind of opportunity, right?
Yeah, well, and that's the type of, so you as a state controller coming out with your analysis on the impact and what we will earn from it is very important. So hopefully they don't think that it's, oh, that's the Democrats are saying this.
Right.
This is this New York State controller and an
Yeah.
analysis of what it would do from a positive point of view in New York State.
Yeah.
So that was a great yesterday, really great.
Let's stick with education for a moment, because I know you for a long time. I can't think of anybody who is a greater fighter for educational opportunity than Robert Jackson.
Thank you.
And the city council you fought, you were community school board president. You did the march up to Albany to bring attention to the issue. You were one of the plaintiffs on the campaign for fiscal equity. As we're starting with the budget process now, obviously school aid is always a big issue, and traditionally the governor, any governor, proposes an amount and the legislature adds to it. But the key issue becomes the distribution of the money as well, not just the total amount. What are your hopes as we start on that negotiation on the education budget? How do you see the outcome, and what would you like to see as the outcome?
Well, you know, the governor came out with a state of the state where he talked about how much money for education and what have you, and you know, the Board of Regents said that we should do much more than what the governor said and then phase in the rest of the money. The state owes New York State children about $4 billion. And of that, let's say New York City about 1.8 or around $2 billion. The bottom line is this, that the New York State Constitution guarantees every child the opportunity to get an adequate education. And as you know, Governor Spitzer, Eliot Spitzer, the former governor, and the state legislature agreed on $9 billion with $5.5 billion for New York City and the rest for the rest of the state. And they put that into a foundation aid formula. So all we're asking is to give us the money that the children of New York State, not only New York City, but you got rural areas and suburban areas, the amount of money that they're entitled to under the foundation aid formula. And so that's what the fight is going to be about. And I say to you, it's going to be a fight. Yeah. People say, where are we going to get the money from? And I said, the money's there. The money's in the budget. The budget is huge. And so it's about priorities. And that's really what it's about. So I hope that the New York State Senate and the Assembly has passed the bill before, but it never has been passed in the state Senate to fund the education money for the children based on the foundation aid formula. So I'm hoping that will happen this year. Let me just say that. If it's not, I'm going to fight to try to make sure it happens.
Yeah. You have an important chairmanship. You're chairing the Committee on Cities in the Senate. And there are so many issues that affect our cities in terms of quality of life. Many of them will probably fall under your jurisdiction.
I'll tell you one thing that Leroy Comrie, who is a member of the Senate, and Leroy chairs the Corporations Authorities Committee, and so we are looking at real soon to be holding a joint committee hearing of the state Senate on the L train situation. And obviously,
we're reading a lot about that L train situation.
Especially, I think yesterday morning, a 20-inch main flooded and they had shut it down for a certain period of time. But the L train, and another thing is obviously the MTA and the whole situation as far as, you know, do they shut it down for a year and a half or do they use this other method? And hearing all of the information about the fact that the board does not have to vote to approve anything, what kind of craziness of this? What do you have a board for if, in fact, they're not going to be able to vote what has to be done in order to improve the environment? And as you know, when you talk about cities, you talk about New York City, you talk about the NYCHA housing. Now, NYCHA housing is New York City Housing Authority. That's a huge issue. So, for example, I would think down the road we should have a joint committee hearing with the Housing Committee of the State Senate. So let me just tell you, with the Cities Committee, I not only chair the Cities Committee, but I am on the Education Committee. I'm a member of the Higher Education Committee. I'm a member of the Housing, Buildings, and Constructions Committee, and I'm a member of the Labor Committee. So I'm involved in 5 state committees,
Very, very
one as
important
a chair
committees.
and
Yeah.
4 as members of.
Yeah.
So with respects to affordability of housing, as you know, in New York City, that's one of the major issues that impact over 1 million rent-stabilized apartments in New York City. And obviously, the issue that we must deal with this year is to try to either deal with that which expires in June.
The rent
of this
regulation
year, the
law.
rent regulation.
Yeah.
And we don't only want to just extend it, we want to roll back some of the situations. So you have obviously the vacancy decontrol bonus
Yeah.
that landlords are given when a lease, a tenant moves out. There's a 20% vacancy bonus given to the owner. You have, in my district, about 60% of the units that are rent stabilized, 30% of them are preferential rent. And for those who don't know, and I'm sure that you know, but preferential rent is where, for example, the legal rent may be like $2,300 and the landlord would rent it to you for $2,000. And then when your lease expires, they can say, well, we're taking you up to $2,300. Yeah. And you say, wait a minute, I can't afford that with my income. So what do? You move out because you can't afford a $300 increase in your rent. You can't afford it. And so then the landlord then gets another vacancy bonus of 20%.
On top of that.
Yeah, and so some of them, I'm not saying all of them, some of them use that in order to try to decontrol a unit. The decontrol, meaning you reach a height of about $2,733. Once you reach that level, as far as an apartment, it's decontrolled. So if a landlord wanted to charge you $4,000 or $5,000 or $3,000, he could or she could. So those are some of the issues that we need to address, and obviously those are major issues that not only impact New York City, but you have part of I think Westchester County and
Nassau County, also
Nassau
covered by-
County,
yeah, where I live, yeah,
So
it's
those
also
are
covered by-
major
yeah.
issues that impact us, and that's going to be dealt with hopefully before June 15th or whenever
When it
the end of
expires,
June.
yeah.
Don't wait till the last minute.
Yeah.
Let's deal with it now. Let's
Yeah.
get that major issue out of the way that impact so many New Yorkers.
Yeah. Well, you look at how, I mean, it's incredible the work that the Senate and the Assembly also, Women's Reproductive Health Act, the voting reforms, the testing issue with our teachers in schools.
Yes.
I mean, you were off to some active start. It seems to me you're going to get a lot done before June, so there should be time to get it done in a fair amount of time.
Well, I do think that we are going to get a lot done, but the APPR, where you're talking about an examination of our children and using their test results to evaluate teachers and administrators, principals, that has to be resolved.
Yeah.
And obviously, it passed in the New York State Senate, and I believe it's passed in the Assembly also, but I voted for that with exceptions. And my exceptions were, we should not be using high-stakes exams of students to evaluate teachers. And so if you're an arts teacher and I'm a physical education teacher, we should not be using a high school regents exam to evaluate you as an art teacher and me as a physical educator.
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And
Well, we're going to have you back to talk about it more because we're running out of time.
No, are you
yes,
serious?
Because we had a lot to cover.
Oh, please
But
invite
Senator
me
Jackson,
back.
you are off to a great start, and your constituents on the West Side are lucky to have you. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Senator Robert Jackson.
you.
Wish you continued success. I also want to thank Assembly Member Harvey Epstein, who was our earlier guest, for sharing his thoughts. I hope our conversations have been thoughtful and offered some perspective into the issues that affect New York City and the people who live here. We'll have Senator Jackson back at a future show. I'm New York State Controller Tom DiNapoli. Thank you for watching Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network.